All right, you're able to hear me, I hope? Okay, great. All right. So I will once again read from Psalm 82, and then we will I will pray, and then we'll get started. Psalm 82, a psalm of Asaph. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Selah. Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, "You are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die, and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations." Let us pray. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we ask that you would lead me through the power of your Spirit so that I could speak the truth from the Scriptures. Enable your people to understand and accept and challenge the view that I present also. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. In an oft-repeated saying, Lord Acton declared, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Critiquing this blanket statement, the American journalist Robert Caro concluded, "What I believe is always true about power is that power always reveals." I think that Caro has understood something that the scriptures have been telling us for millennia now, but which we Christians have assiduously refused to accept. Now, 2 weeks back, we began our exploration of the Divine Counsel Worldview. What we managed to cover in that session might seem to be very little. We only managed to reimagine what we mean by the words God and monotheism. We saw that the Hebrew word Elohim is used in a variety of ways in the Old Testament. It can refer to Yahweh, to spiritual beings, to pagan deities, and to human judges. Hence, we must be careful with our translations. We saw that since the Bible seems to refer to different categories as Elohim, and since Paul also indicates in 1 Corinthians that there are multiple entities that can rightly be designated with the word theos, using the word monotheism to describe the Christian faith is problematic, because there are others who use the word God in English to mean something quite different from what it would mean in a monotheistic context, and we must be careful about that. Today we continue our study of the Divine Counsel Worldview, and whereas last time we dealt with the details of various words, today we will zoom out and discuss the big picture. And whereas last time we began with the first verse of Psalm 82, today we will begin with the last verse, which reads, Kuma Elohim Sabta Haaretz Ki ata tinchal Bekal Hagoyim. The ESV renders it as, "Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations." And right away we should be thinking that this is a strange thing to say to God. God will inherit all the nations? What does that even mean? Does he not already possess all the nations? And if he were to inherit the nations, from whom would he inherit them? Now, these are pertinent questions and ones we must wrestle with if we hope to understand what the psalmist is claiming. So for that, we will turn to Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9, and we will return to that towards the end again. Yeah? So Moses is in the middle of his final speech in Deuteronomy, and to help the Israelites, he gives them a way of understanding their relationship to the other nations. He says, "When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage." If any of you is reading along in your Bible, you may find a slight discrepancy in the text towards the end. if you have the NIV or KJV or NASB, you may read the phrase sons of Israel instead of sons of God at the end of verse 8. This is because there are differences in various sources. The Masoretic text, compiled between the 7th and 10th centuries AD, and from which we have the basis of the Hebrew text for our Old Testament, has the words Bnei Yisrael, which is sons of Israel. So the Masoretic text supports the translation sons of Israel, and therefore supports the NIV, KJV, NASB, etc. However, the Greek Septuagint from the 3rd century BC, and therefore predating the Masoretic text by millennia, has the words Angelon Theou. Translated into English, this would read angels of God. So the Septuagint from the 3rd century BC has angels of God. And there is absolutely no way to get either from angels of God to sons of Israel or the other way around. Hence, most of our early translations just went with the Masoretic text, which reads sons of Israel. And so they translated the last part of verse 8 as sons of Israel. However, the manuscript DSS 4QDT, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls found in the 4th cave at Qumran, and dating to earlier than the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, has the reading B'nai Elohim, which would translate to sons of God as in the ESV. So, which one is the original reading? We have three. Sons of God, sons of Israel, angels of God. It is easy to see how both sons of Israel and angels of God derive from sons of God, since both of those require just one change to be made. Sons changed to angels gives you angels of God. God changed to Israel gives you sons of Israel. This is the simplest explanation, and according to the principle of Occam's razor, should be the one that we should adopt, which means that Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 refers to a group of beings called sons of God. But who are these sons of God? And what was their original vocation? In most places in the Old Testament, the phrase sons of God refers to some group of non-physical entities. One notable exception, as mentioned last time, is in Genesis chapter 6, where the context seems to require that we understand sons of God in that passage as referring to human rulers. But for the most part, sons of God refers to some group of non-physical entities. This is also clear from Deuteronomy chapter 32, where the contrast is drawn between the sons of God, who are apportioned the nations, and Yahweh, whose portion is said to be Israel. We can draw two very important conclusions from this. First, we are talking about real people groups, not political nations. This is simply because the setting of Deuteronomy is prior to the formation of Israel as a nation. Otherwise, we would have to conclude that when Israel was not a nation, Israel was not Yahweh's inheritance. We can clearly see that from the perspective of Judaism and Christianity, this view is absurd. Yahweh's covenant with Israel is not dependent on their being a nation. This is crucial and is something the Israelites understood only after they were taken into exile, and something we Christians forgot when we began to have an individualistic focus in our faith. Second, sons of God in Deuteronomy 32 cannot refer to human rulers because the number of human rulers keeps changing as nations wage war against each other, resulting in fewer nations through assimilation or conquest, or more nations through civil war or secession. For the matter of the inheritance to each people group to make sense, the number of sons of God needs to be constant, and that would imply that they are not human rulers. If the sons of God in Deuteronomy 32 does not refer to human rulers, then it must refer to some non-physical beings. Now, the study of non-physical beings has taken a backseat in evangelical circles over the past few years, centuries maybe even. There was a time when Christian scholars debated such inane things as the number of angels that could dance on the head of a pin. Yes, I am not joking. We were so bored that we needed to inspire ourselves thinking about all this madness. But the complete ignoring of the non-physical realm is not the answer either. From the Enlightenment on, we have left the study of the non-physical realm to people on the fringes of the church. As a result, we have a very stunted understanding of the non-physical realm, thinking it only consists of angels and demons, the good guys and the bad guys, without recognizing that the Bible itself uses a much larger vocabulary to describe these beings. For example, in Genesis chapter 3, we read about the cherubs, and they are described in such a manner that should make us rethink what we commonly mean by cherub or cherubic. In Isaiah chapter 6, we read about the seraphs, who seem to be distinct from the cherubs. And in Daniel chapter 4, we are told about a category known as the watchers. And in Daniel chapter 10, about the prince of Persia. And we are also introduced to Michael, who is called the chief prince, even though he is clearly not human. Then, in Job, we read about the sons of God and are told about an office bearer known as the accuser or the adversary, a figure that seems to show up again in Zechariah chapter 3, though now in a more adversarial role than in Job. With such a wide range of words to describe different categories of non-physical beings, it is really sad that we have devolved into the simplistic categories of angels and demons, which prevents us from understanding the biblical text. Before we attempt to understand what the divine counsel is made of, let us look at different passages that clearly indicate the presence of such a counsel. Without that, it's pointless to talk about them. Our journey begins with Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel is given a vision of different beasts. And in the middle of the vision we read, "As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat." The vision clearly indicates that there were multiple thrones, and that the Ancient of Days sits on one of them. But the passage in Daniel does not give us an exact count of the number of thrones. We could get that if we looked at Revelation chapter 4, where we read, "Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders." So there seems to be 25 thrones in all, one for Yahweh and 24 for the elders. At least, there may be more, maybe another scene, who knows. But let's not rush to identify the elders, or it may prejudice our understanding of other passages. We next look at Isaiah chapter 6. This is the prophet's famous vision in the temple shortly after King Uzziah died. There, he hears the words, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" We rarely pause to think of the disjunction between the two personal pronouns in the verse. In the first instance, it is a singular, I, while in the second, it's a plural, us. Yahweh asks, "Whom shall I send?" indicating that there is one sender. But he also asks, "Who will go for us?" implying that whoever is sent would represent more than one. A common Christian way of understanding this is to think of the plural as a reference to the Trinity. However, if there is a counsel surrounding Yahweh, then we need not understand the disjunction in pronouns as a reference to a Christian doctrine. That would have been just not understood by the Jews. After all, we need to discipline ourselves to understand the text as the ancient Israelites would have done so. We encounter a similar instance of disjunction in Genesis chapter 1, where in verse 26, God declares, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." While in the next verse we read, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them." In verse 26, God announces the intention of making humans in, quote, our image. While in verse 27, we are told that God created humans in, quote, his image. Once again, a common Christian understanding is to see this as a reference to the Trinity. And once again, we must discipline ourselves and not read into the text something that is not necessary to understand it. If, as so many other passages indicate, there seems to be a counsel around Yahweh, then we do not need to invoke the Christian doctrine of the Godhead to account for the various plural personal pronouns we find all over the place. But what is the purpose of this counsel? How does it function? In order to think about how it might function, consider an example. Let's say that after this COVID pandemic ends, my family decides to have dinner at some restaurant. I may ask for restaurant suggestions from my wife or daughters. We may have a discussion. Someone suggests this, another suggests that. And in the end, we may take a decision collectively. But in the end, it will perhaps be just I who will actually drive the car. It will be I who will foot the bill. So you can see that even though there is a collective decision-making process, there is one person who is finally responsible for some parts of the action that follows. I could very well tell the story as follows. Then Deepak said, "Where should we go to eat? And at which restaurant should we eat our dinner?" And after much discussion, one said one thing and another said another. I drove to the chosen restaurant where, after we had dinner, I paid the bill. If I narrated the story in this manner, no one would have any difficulty understanding what was being said. You would not fault me for switching between singular and plural personal pronouns because you understand what was said. Somehow, such an easy approach to understanding the text is actually obscured by the traditional Christian belief in one God and, interestingly, our belief in a triune God. In this case, insisting on monotheistic Trinitarianism can obscure the text. But if God can rightfully declare, "Let us create man in our image," and the pronoun "our" does not refer to the Trinity, then does that mean that there are other beings who are in the image of God? And as soon as we ask that question, we need to ask, what does it mean to be created in the image of God? Of course, once we ask that, we need to ask, is that really how the text in Genesis 1 should be translated? In the end, it is about the text. The text in Genesis 1 reads, "Naase Adam basalmenu kidmetenu." Yeah? The English phrase "in our image" is problematic if we are honest, because quite frankly, we have no idea what to make sense of it grammatically. And that is because that small preposition "in," when we say "in our image," the small preposition "in" has multiple meanings. Consider the following sentence. "In a day's time, I will write in prose, in ink, in a book, while in my pajamas, in time to meet a deadline." 6 occurrences of the word "in," and all 6 with different meanings. So let me repeat that sentence again so you can catch the nuances. "In a day's time, I will write in prose, in ink, in a book, while in my pajamas, in time to meet a deadline." And this is just a small subset of the different ways the word "in" can be used. So while translating the preposition "but" with the word "in" is lexically correct, it tells us precious little about how that word is used in context. For that, we will have to look carefully at the context, but let us first consider some ways of interpreting the image of God that arise from reading into the text. Some claim that it is our intellect, emotions, and free will that constitute the image of God. What then do we say of someone who has a low intellect or is suffering from some brain degeneracy that prevents them from expressing and experiencing emotions? Are they not in the image of God? Others have claimed that it is our ability to think rationally that constitutes the image of God. Does that mean someone who has lost the ability to think rationally is not the image of God? 7 years ago, I had a risky brain surgery, and it was a possibility that I would have emerged in a vegetative state. By God's grace, I did not. But had I emerged in a vegetative state, would that have meant that I was no longer the image of God? Still others think that it is our ability to have an aesthetic sense that is the image of God. Does that mean a blind person, a deaf person, is deficient in some way, not the image of God, because that person cannot have a visual or auditory aesthetic appreciation? Still others say that it is our ability to plan for the future that is our image of God, that is the image of God. Does this mean that someone with dementia that affects the ability to think in the future is not in the image of God? Still others claim that it's our moral sense that constitutes the image of God. Does this mean that a criminal is no longer the image of God and has forfeited it while committing the crime? Even others claim that it is our ability to maintain relationships that constitutes the image of God. Does this mean that someone with Asperger's syndrome is not in the image of God? Each of these approaches is based on some traits that most humans possess. But as soon as we say that most humans possess these traits, it means some don't. And as soon as we exclude some humans from being the image of God, we allow ourselves to think less of them, less than human. And then all it needs is someone to come along and justify all sorts of atrocities in the name of them being less than human. That's what happened when the Hutus called the Tutsis Inyenzis, cockroaches. That's what happened when Christians called the Jews God killers. So you see, it is not a small matter to correctly understand what the image of God is. And you should be able to see that none of the interpretations I have mentioned earlier have anything to do with what's in the text. None of those words is there in the text. In fact, it seems that these views have gone out of their way to ignore and obscure the meaning that is so clear in the text. And I believe this is just another example of what happened when humans ate the forbidden fruit. We can discuss that some other day. So let us see what the text says. Genesis 1:26 says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps over the earth." Dominion is what designates humans as the image of God. We are constituted to be the image of God by virtue of our vocation to exercise authority. Here a word of caution is in order. The word dominion may make us think of domineering or dominating, and while they all stem from the same word, the word dominion simply means rule or authority and says nothing about the manner in which the authority or rule is expressed or exercised. That must come, as always, from the context of the text and not from any preconceived notions that we may have. So just because someone abused their authority does not mean that the vocation to exercise authority has been revoked. As Paul says in Romans chapter 11, verse 29, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. Just because we refuse to exercise our vocation appropriately and have abdicated our rule does not mean that God has accepted our abdication. Rather, whether they know it or not, whether they like it or not, all humans are the image of God because they are human. Not because they possess any trait or anything, but simply because they are human. In other words, to be human is to be the image of God. So I would translate the preposition "but," not within, but as or to be. In that case, Genesis 1:26 would read, "Let us make man as our image," or "Let us make man to be our image." Now, an image is only a representation of reality. Consider my driver's license picture and a picture taken at my wedding with my wife. Both of these pictures will allow you to recognize me. However, my driver's license picture will not tell you if I'm married. My wedding picture will not tell you if I'm qualified to drive. That is because both these images were made to serve different purposes. They cannot function outside that purpose. So when we look at the text in Genesis 1, it is clear that the nature of the image that is that of exercising dominion over the physical realm, for God specifically mentions dominion over the flora and fauna that flourish on the earth. Let me restate what we have concluded so we can move on ahead. Looking carefully at the text of Genesis 1, we have concluded that the image of God is not some trait that humans possess, but a vocation given by God to humans by virtue of His making them human. That is, the image of God is what it means to be human, and the aspect involved in being God's image that we are given is that of dominion. We are to exercise dominion over the physical realm. That automatically raises the question, what about the non-physical realm? Now, being a mathematics teacher, I am wary of making hasty generalizations. I have a sample set of one, the physical realm, and we have concluded something on the basis of the text in Genesis 1. I cannot draw conclusions about the non-physical realm from what we have concluded about the physical realm with just that one text. So, let us turn to 1 Kings chapter 22. This is the story of when Jehoshaphat was going to partner with Ahab to fight Syria. Jehoshaphat goes to Israel and he and Ahab seek advice from the prophets of the northern kingdom. All of those prophets with one voice tell Ahab, go ahead, launch an attack against Syria, you're going to win. Jehoshaphat is not so convinced. He asks Ahab if there is a prophet of Yahweh around there. Ahab says, yeah, there is, but I don't like this guy. Yeah. You see, Micaiah ben Imlach, the prophet of Yahweh, knowing Ahab's wicked ways, never prophesied any good things for Ahab. And so Ahab developed a deep hatred for Micaiah. Anyway, Jehoshaphat insists on Micaiah coming along. When Micaiah comes to them, he initially, but sarcastically, agrees with what Ahab's prophets had said. Go ahead, God is going to give you victory. But then he, I guess, observes the sarcastic voice in what Micaiah was saying, and Ahab then orders Micaiah to tell him exactly what Yahweh told him. So Micaiah proceeds. So this is what he says. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him, on his right hand and on his left. And Yahweh said, who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before Yahweh and said, I will entice him. And Yahweh said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all of his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Again, in this passage, we are introduced to that divine counsel called the host, the heavenly host. And here we actually see it in action. Yahweh is in the midst. He has taken a seat there in the midst of his council members. They're standing on his right and on his left. He declares that it is time for Ahab to pay for all his wickedness. And he asks for suggestions. How are we going to do this? Note that Yahweh does not ask them to decide if Ahab has to be punished. He has already made that decision. Rather, he asks his council members to suggest methods. What strategy to entice Ahab. Then we read, and one said one thing, another said another. In other words, there's contributions from different members of the council. One suggests one plan, another says another, some third suggests, they're discussing. Finally, one of the council members says, hey, I have a plan. I will lie to Ahab through his prophets. And Yahweh approves of this plan of action. He says, yeah, okay, you're going to do that. And he declares that the plan will succeed. So Yahweh knows it's going to succeed. So here, he has invited participation from his council members. They all contribute. And then he selects one out of them and says, and he gives that person the task of going ahead. So the participation here in this council is an exercise of authority. They are making decisions there. Yahweh has expressed a desire to delegate authority of enticing Ahab to one of his trusted lieutenants. Note that the decision to punish Ahab is solely Yahweh's. None of his council members participate in that decision, and that is simply because justice demands the knowledge of the whole picture, and only Yahweh has the full picture. It would have been unjust to invite the council members to make that decision. So he does not do that. But he asks them to make the decision about how they would convince Ahab to wage war against Syria. And the one whose plan Yahweh approves of is then given the authority to implement that plan. Now, does this mean that Yahweh needs the council to implement his will? Does it mean that he needs humans to enable the physical world to flourish? Absolutely not. Yahweh could do all of this by himself. However, when he made the non-physical creatures and the physical creatures, he designated among them some who would wield authority on his behalf. The members of the divine council do that in the non-physical realm, while we humans do it in the physical realm. For some reason, and we'll get to it shortly, Yahweh finds pleasure and joy in working through his creatures, those whom he has tasked with exercising authority on his behalf. So, when we read in Genesis 1 verse 26, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, this is just Yahweh speaking to his non-physical divine council members, telling them that his plan was to create physical creatures, humans, who would be tasked with exercising authority on his behalf. We don't need to think that this is a hint about the Trinity, nor do we need to think that this would call into question Yahweh's absolute sovereignty over all of creation. delegation does not mean lack of authority. We have to keep that in mind. So now we understand that the divine council comprises those non-physical beings who exercise authority that Yahweh has delegated to them. But who are these beings? We have seen that the classification of non-physical beings into angels and demons is simplistic, since there are many other categories that the scriptures mention. In fact, the word angel in Hebrew is malak, and in Greek is angelos, and both of them just mean messenger. In other words, an angel is just a messenger. They are important for sure, but they are not the ones with authority, they are the ones with a message. So who are the non-physical beings who form the divine council? In Psalm 82 verse 1, they are called Elohim. In verse 6 there, they are called Bnei Elyon, translated as sons of the Most High. In Psalm 89 verse 6, they are called Bnei Elim, translated as sons of God or sons of might. In Revelation chapter 4, those around the throne are called presbyteros, translated as elders. Our second last passage now is Daniel chapter 4, where the decision about Nebuchadnezzar's punishment is said to be by the decree of the Urim, translated as watchers, and referred to as Kadashim, or holy ones, in the next clause. Now the entire chapter, that portion of Daniel is in Aramaic, so both Urim and Kadashim are Aramaic words. Before we look at the last passage, let us recount the different ways in which the divine council is referred to. We have Elohim, we have Bnei Elyon, we have Bnei Elim, presbyteros, Urim, Kadashim. So, Elohim, which we saw has many meanings last time. Then we have sons of Most High, sons of God, sons of might, elders, watchers, holy ones. What a breadth of meanings, what a breadth of ways of describing this group. It's just mind-boggling. But one thing we can conclude is that all of these are titles. They don't tell us anything about these people. They designate something about the group, what they're tasked with doing, that sort of thing. So please recall from 2 weeks back. We shouldn't assume that there is some kind of a Platonic realm of ideas, and when we use a word, we are actually referring to something in the realm of ideas. That is, for example, there is no such thing as an idea about the sons of the Most High. And when we say sons of the Most High, then in the divine council, they're just one expression of this, this idea in the temporal realm. That's not what it is. We really don't have any information about what kind of non-physical beings constitute the divine council. We could use any of these other above terms, but we should recognize that the terms do not denote any traits inherent in these beings, but rather, as in the rest of the Old Testament, indicate the status of these beings and the task that they have been given by God. So, yes, we don't know who these beings are. Yeah? So, since it's about the task, that means what is the task given to the divine council? And so we come to the last passage in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. I told you we'll come back to that later. So this is what it reads, When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided the sons of man, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the numbers of the sons of God. But Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. Now remember, there is a variant reading where some later texts read sons of Israel instead of sons of God at the end of verse 8. Deuteronomy 32 seems to indicate that there was a time when Yahweh divided mankind into nations. Here another reminder is in order, namely that the word nations does not refer to political groups such as we know today, but to people groups. Deuteronomy 32 indicates that Yahweh divided humanity into groups according to the number of sons of God. If we read Genesis chapter 10, we will see that there are 70 nations mentioned there, excluding Israel. This explains the variant because in Genesis 46 verse 27, we read that the household of Jacob numbered 70 people. However, why this should be relevant to the division of mankind is inexplicable. So what Deuteronomy 32 tells us is that Yahweh divided humanity into groups or nations keeping in mind the number of the sons of God. Presumably, there were and are 70 sons of God, and so God divided humanity into 71 groups, one being Israel. But Deuteronomy also tells us that Yahweh kept Israel as his own heritage. How are we to understand what is being described here? And what is the reason and purpose behind it? Genesis chapters 10, 11, and 12 are linked closely. In Genesis 10, we are given the names of the 70 nations recognized in the Old Testament. Again, nations is people groups. Then in Genesis chapter 11, we are told about what provided the impetus for this division. And in Genesis chapter 12, we are told about Yahweh's plan in light of Genesis 11. Briefly, in Genesis 11, rejecting God's command to spread through the earth, humans decide to gather in the plains of Shinar. Their plan is to make a name for themselves by building a ziggurat reaching to heaven. From Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 to 11, it seems that the narrative intends us to take this to have happened under the rule of Nimrod. Whatever he did, Nimrod managed to get people to create an aphorism about himself, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. In other words, Nimrod is the archetypal person who attempts to make a name for themselves. The Tower of Babel, a ziggurat reaching to the skies, touching the heavens, and so paving a way either for the gods to descend to earth or for humans to storm the heavens, was supposed to be a monument to themselves. Let us make a name for ourselves, primarily Nimrod. It has been so all throughout human history that rulers have attempted to make a name for themselves. The practice continues this day wherever a leader has sycophantic followers. And wherever we start treating someone as larger than life, the ghost of Babel will raise its head to haunt us. To the contrary, in Genesis 12, Yahweh calls a nomad with this promise: "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." Whereas Nimrod and the people of Babel wanted to make a name for themselves, Yahweh tells Abraham that he would make Abraham's name great. Whereas Nimrod and the people at Babel thought of making structures to preserve their name in perpetuity, Yahweh tells Abraham that he would be remembered by people because he and his descendants after him would be a source of blessing for all the nations. Whereas Nimrod and the people of Babel sought to be remembered for all the possessions they had, Yahweh tells Abraham that he would be remembered for the blessings that he shared. Why have I made this detour into Genesis 10 to 12? Following the judgment of the flood, God reissued his original commission to humans to be fruitful and to multiply and to spread throughout the earth. They were to willingly spread through the earth, sharing in its bounty and experiencing the generous beneficence of God. However, humans rejected this and chose to form groups with high population densities, finally forming city-states. And what arises automatically from high population densities? I'm going to say things that may be uncomfortable now. First, disease. From the simple fact that bacteria and viruses now do not need to travel too far to infect another person, a phenomenon that has affected the whole world now for a year and a half. Second, scarcity, leading to a competition for resources, like we have today for groceries, vaccines, tests. Third, violence, from the struggle between those who compete for the now scarce but essential resources for life. We who live in urban centers during this pandemic have experienced this dark side of high population densities for some months now. But even in normal times, things are not quite rosy. In his groundbreaking book, Guns, Germs and Steel, Jared Diamond writes, "Once food can be stockpiled, a political elite can gain control of food produced by others, assert the right of taxation, escape the need to feed itself, and engage full-time in political activities." The decision to live in close quarters with each other in cities with high population densities brings with it many problems we deal with on a day-to-day basis, but which we have grown accustomed to and which we think are simply the way things ought to be. But as David Hume, in one of his more honest moments, argued, we should not conclude anything about how things ought to be from the way we find things are. So what has happened? We've got a lot of evil around us and we have to explain that, right? According to some who support the divine counsel worldview, Genesis 10 to 12 narrates the event referred to in Deuteronomy 32. According to them, when humans rejected God's command to spread through the world and to be fruitful and multiply, God punished them by confusing the languages of the people, dispersing them throughout the world. In doing this, he divided humanity into 71 groups. One group, the people of Israel, he kept to himself, while the other 70 listed in Genesis chapter 10, he assigned to different members of his divine council, called sons of God in Deuteronomy 32 verse 8. According to these interpreters, this group called sons of God is the same group as mentioned in Genesis 6. They are also called sons of God. And according to these interpreters, these are actually fallen, non-physical beings. These interpreters, based on the first book of Enoch, identify these sons of God with the watchers. According to the book of Enoch, the watchers are the members of the divine council, who at some point in human history prior to the flood took on human form and had sexual intercourse with human women, giving rise to the group called the Nephilim. According to these interpreters, when God punished the human race after Babel, he assigned the non-Israelite nations to these watchers, who are judged in Psalm 82. I do not buy this interpretation for one bit. But before I proceed to discuss why I reject this view of the link between Genesis 10 to 12, Deuteronomy 32, and Psalm 82, let us assume this view is true and ask a simple question. What does this tell us about the nature and character of God and how he administers this world? To answer that, let us set the stage carefully with a timeline, because it is crucial we understand the sequence of events. Please note, I am now not going to be outlining the view I hold, but the view that some who support the divine counsel worldview hold. I will let you know when I begin my own view. So let's begin. At some time before the flood, the watchers who are assigned with tasks of various parts of the world and people group, etc., they notice human women and they find them attractive. Then they proceed to take human form and they violate some of those human women and produce unnatural offspring known as Nephilim, who were present at the time of Noah and later as well. However, despite the judgment of the flood, humans continue to rebel, leading up to the great disobedience at Babel. God judges the humans at Babel, confuses their language, and splits them into 71 people groups, Israel for himself, and disperses the rest of the 70 throughout the world. God then assigns those 70 nations to the watchers. But since the watchers are fallen, they entice humans into sin and violence, which is why human societies are so prone to sinful and violent behavior. I have finished describing the predominant view among those who support the divine counsel worldview. Let me present my critique. It is important to observe that we are never told that the watchers ever repented of having violated the human women. Remember, I'm still assuming that it is true. Yeah, I'm still assuming that it is that perspective is true. I will go and show why it is not. Yeah, so this is a critique within that worldview, within that view. Yeah, assuming it is to be true. So we are never told that the watchers ever repented of that violating human women. Even though First Enoch devotes a lot of space discussing the watchers, there is not a slightest hint that the watchers ever repented or ever even had second thoughts about what they had done. So what do we make of God assigning the other nations to them? I'm going to use a stark example so that we can see things very clearly. It is as though God took a group of unrepentant pedophiles and made them principals of the schools of the region. Remember that the watchers are those who violated human women and they haven't repented. Yet according to this view, God placed the watchers over the other nations where half the population constitutes those whom these watchers had violated. An absolutely bizarre policy decision, if ever there was one. You can see why I reject this view. It presents a God who is unconcerned about the well-being of women and who intentionally places them in danger by assigning their predators to govern them. It is a bizarre view of God, a view of a God who is so unjust that he willingly and willfully placed the perpetrators of a crime in a position of authority over their victims. It is such a disgusting view that I cannot believe any Christian can hold it. But those who support this view think that they have biblical support. To justify their reliance on 1 Enoch, they say that 2 Peter and Jude refer to the casting of these fallen watchers into Tartarus, an idea that appears in 1 Enoch. They say that this means that Peter and Jude accept that this is exactly what happened to the watchers. Now, I have multiple objections to this conclusion, but again, let's assume for the moment that the conclusion is correct. I'm a mathematics teacher. Proof by contradiction is very important. Yeah. Even if Peter and Jude's reference to 1 Enoch indicates that the watchers are bound in Tartarus, it does not follow that the watchers were given dominion over the nations in Genesis 10 to 12 and Deuteronomy 32. This is a fallacious argument with no basis in the biblical text, because there is absolutely no link between Genesis 10 to 12 and Deuteronomy 32 on the one hand and 1 Enoch on the other. Remember, the word watchers appears only in Daniel, not in Genesis 10 to 12 or Deuteronomy 32. In fact, there is a logical problem with viewing the watchers as beings who are assigned to the other nations. Simply put, if the fallen watchers are, as according to 1 Enoch, being held captive in Tartarus, how can they exercise dominion over the nations? And if God's plan was that the other nations would be governed by the watchers while he focused on Israel, what are these other nations doing after the watchers rebelled and were imprisoned? They would just be going off on their own. Yeah. But more problematic is the assumption that just because Peter and Jude allude to an episode in 1 Enoch, they must be accepting the view of the book lock, stock and barrel. Or even that they must be accepting the event actually happened as in 1 Enoch. Those who have heard me preach will know that I used examples from movies and novels. I quote from atheists and Muslims and Hindus and Jews and Buddhists. It does not mean that I accept everything that the sources I quote from claim. It's just that at certain points, I find some examples that are helpful to illuminate a point I am making. So if I quote from Yoda from Star Wars, it would be quite foolish to conclude that I truly believe that a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, some events happened that are depicted in the Star Wars movie series. You can see how foolish that is. We need to allow the biblical authors also to use examples just as we do. Otherwise, from Jude's quote from the Assumption of Moses, that's another quote he has, we would have to conclude that Jude believed everything that is in the Assumption of Moses. And from Acts chapter 17, we would have to say Paul accepted everything that the Greek poet Aratus wrote, because Paul quotes from him when he says, "In him we live and move and have our being." Anyone who is used to giving illustrative examples in their speech or writing will refuse to make such conclusions. It's absurd. Moreover, while 1 Enoch may give us background material necessary to understand 2 Peter and Jude, and it does, we must be careful when using the book. There is a reason why neither the Jewish rabbis nor the early Christian church considered the book inspired. Two current Christian traditions, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church and the Eritrean Orthodox Tewahedo Church, accept the book of Enoch as canonical. However, again, it is crucial to observe that their canonical book of Enoch differs from the Greek text of 1 Enoch that supporters of the Watcher's view of the divine counsel use, precisely in that their canonical book of Enoch does not contain the speculation about the Watchers and the linking of them with what happened in Genesis 6. Without this speculation, the book of Enoch is kind of a dreary book, but it does not contain any problematic ideas. It's not a very interesting book. Okay, let me just say. Anyway, So what do I think happened in Genesis 10 to 12, Deuteronomy 32, and Psalm 82? So here is my view. Following the flood, God tells Noah, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done, while earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. But despite his forbearance, humans remain wicked. And so God unveils a different approach. Rather than focusing on all of humanity, he would focus on one people, Israel. But the rest of humanity was his creation too. He had to ensure that they would be taken care of. So he assigned members of his divine council to guide and govern the other nations. They were supposed to steer the other nations in ways of justice and righteousness and truth. However, because the council members are creatures, they do not possess all wisdom. And because they are creatures, their perspective is limited, and they end up making mistakes here and there. As a result of their mistakes, justice is compromised and injustice spreads. Now please note, God has not placed rebellious non-physical beings on his council to govern other nations. That would be blatantly unjust. Rather, because he planned to work closely with one people group, the Israelites, he delegated the task of guidance and governance of the other nations to his council members. Why did he do it like this? The God of our scriptures, the God revealed in our scriptures, is a God who loves to share power and authority. Unlike most human rulers, he does not centralize power and holds it and hoards it, but decentralizes and distributes it. But why does he do this? Remember the quote from Robert Caro in the beginning? What I believe is always true about power is that power always reveals. Power reveals what is in our hearts. The greater the authority we have to exert over others, the more we are tempted to abuse that authority. And note that it will not necessarily be because we want to subjugate others. Rather, we may end up justifying all sorts of evil policies in the name of the greater good. Consider what Jared Diamond says about the Fertile Crescent in Guns, Germs and Steel. The Fertile Crescent, the Eastern Mediterranean societies, had the misfortune to arise in an ecologically fragile environment. They committed ecological suicide by destroying their own resource base. The idea of forming a sedentary agrarian society seemed to be one that is steeped in wisdom. A lot of our developments, what we have today, we are living in urban societies precisely because of that. But the Fertile Crescent is now mostly barren wastelands. So we are now in a position to summarize what the Divine Counsel worldview is. The Bible presents a supreme being, Yahweh, who does not hoard authority and power, but who willingly shares his authority and power with his creatures. Yahweh created everything that is visible and everything that is invisible. In the visible realm, he created this universe that we can study with our senses, from the largest galaxy to the tiniest quantum particle. He created all life, both botanical and zoological. He created this universe with incomprehensible diversity, and in order to govern it, he created humans to be agents of his good governance over all that is visible. In like manner, he created everything in the invisible realm, and there too he made an invisible realm with unimaginable diversity. And in order to govern it, he created beings that formed his divine counsel, and to whom he gave authority. But Yahweh always wanted the visible and invisible realms to interlock, because only then could he have a full-fledged relationship with his visible creation. And so he assigned the members of his divine council to also have governing roles to play in the visible realm. In this way, the two parts of creation, visible and invisible, are held together by the members of his divine council. The divine council members are not fallen spiritual beings. Rather, they are beings who, like us, are limited and fallible, and therefore prone to making mistakes and errors of judgment. And so Yahweh calls them to account, like he does in Psalm 82, just as he calls us to account when we make mistakes. In short, the divine counsel is the equivalent to the concept of the image of God in the invisible realm. Both the divine counsel and the image of God are biblical concepts that tell us something about two kinds of being, non-physical and physical. These are beings to whom Yahweh has delegated some of his authority because of his deep desire to share power and authority. In other words, the divine counsel, like the image of God, is the Bible's way of inviting us to embark on the difficult task of reimagining authority. But the way the Bible does it, and the message we need to take from the idea of the divine counsel, runs against what the wisdom of our age would have us believe. Sir Francis Bacon first gave us the common saying, "Knowledge itself is power." However, while Bacon most likely was talking about the fact that knowledge does not diminish when shared, and therefore its power lies in its being shared, today it has a different meaning. For example, it is claimed that knowledge is power means that a person has education and a complete control on his or her life by using that knowledge. Complete control over one's life. I think most of us are quite educated. How completely in control of our lives are we? It's sad that we think that education can do that. It takes us back to Genesis chapter 3, where humans reached out in vain for something that they desperately need: the ability to tell how to act, or in the words of Scripture, the knowledge of good and evil. We have accumulated knowledge at an unprecedented rate over the past couple of centuries, and exponentially so in the last few decades. Yet the last century was the one that saw the most bloodshed caused by well-educated people. And the divine counsel and image of God stand as a warning to us that unless we temper and guide our knowledge with divine wisdom, we will only use our knowledge to exercise power over others, to dominate them, and yes, to shed their blood in the pursuit of what seems best to us and best for us. For if anything can be said that we humans badly need, it is for God to use the ideas of the divine counsel and the image of God to enable us finally to reimagine authority. Thank you.